It was a physical sensation in my chest that I already knew that object. Not curiosity, recognition. There's a pattern that runs through 4,000 years of human record, Egyptian priests, a Greek philosopher, two American visionaries who never met each other, all describing the exact sensation that locked my body in place. The lost continent and the soul that remembers everything before it was born come from the same philosopher, the same decade of his work. He never separated those two ideas. An Egyptian scribe 4,000 years ago would have treated that freeze in your body as data to record, not an illusion to dismiss. Stop. This isn't archaeology of a lost continent. This is a pattern of recognition running through a philosopher, two visionaries who never met, and maybe you right now listening to this. The question was never whether Atlantis existed. It's whether that sensation, yours, is data worth taking seriously.
It was a Saturday afternoon inside a museum of Egyptian archaeology. In an unremarkable case, in the corner of a room almost no one visited, sat a fragment of a statuette, a scribe, seated, papyrus across his knees, his face nearly worn away by time. No plaque explained the piece. Just an approximate date, written in pencil on a small card taped to the glass. I stood there. I couldn't tell you for how long. People kept moving toward the next room. A guard looked at me twice, the way someone looks when they expect you to move along too. I couldn't make myself walk away. It wasn't academic curiosity. It was a physical sensation in my chest that I already knew that object, not Egypt in general, that specific piece with that specific wear on the figure's left shoulder. There's a pattern that runs through 4,000 years of human record, Egyptian priests, a Greek philosopher, two American visionaries who never met each other, all describing, without ever citing one another, the exact sensation that locked my body in place in front of that case. If you think that was just suggestion or too much internet culture stuck in your head, wait until you understand why an Egyptian scribe 4,000 years ago would have treated that freeze in your body as data to record, not an illusion to dismiss. What did a scribe once called thrice-great see at the end of an entire world that made him keep recording afterward? Why did a Greek philosopher never separate the continent that sank from the theory that your soul already knew everything before you were born? And what does that feeling, still sitting in my chest, have to do with either one? To answer that, I have to go back further than all of it, to papyri older than the Hebrew Bible itself. Most videos about Thoth start with the emerald tablets. I start earlier with the authentic demotic papyri, 2,000 years old, translated by Richard Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zauzich. Not because the rest doesn't matter, because without this foundation, there's no way to separate what's history from what's tradition built afterward. In these papyri, Thoth appears described as the one who praises knowledge, thrice great. That epithet, thrice great, is the direct historical origin of the word Trismegistus. It didn't come from some esoteric channel. It came from ancient Egypt, recorded in fragments preserved in Berlin, Copenhagen, Florence, Paris, and Vienna. These papyri deal with the scribe's craft, sacred geography, and a journey through the Egyptian underworld, the duat. One of the dialogues is between Thoth and a disciple who asks how to become worthy of knowledge. The answer isn't a ritual. It's a discipline of attention, repeated every day with no shortcut. And even earlier, more than 4,000 years ago, the pyramid texts already described something similar, the soul transforming, rising to join the stars that never set, called the Ach, the glorified spirit. Those stars were chosen because they never vanish below the horizon, unlike the sun. The Egyptians looked up at the sky and chose as the soul's destination exactly what looked permanent, a soul that exists, takes shape, and travels before and after the body. That idea wasn't born in the 20th century. It's one of the oldest written records our species ever preserved, older than the Hebrew Bible, older than the Homeric poems, older than any esoteric tradition you've ever heard named. That's not decoration. It's the difference between a video that treats the soul as an abstract concept and a video that treats the soul as something with a documented trajectory before any modern esoteric tradition even enters the conversation. Given that ground, what's really at stake now is a different question. If this soul travels, what did it see before it got here? The debate about Atlantis usually gets treated as something recent, the kind of thing you hear on an esoteric channel, an alternative theory. But look back far enough, and the pattern is older and stranger than that. It's Plato in the 4th century before Christ who first wrote Atlantis down in the Timaeus and the Critias. By his account, the story came from Egyptian priests told to a Greek lawmaker named Solon more than 100 years earlier, an advanced civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, destroyed in a single day and night. That same Plato in the Meno and the Phaedo taught something else, that learning isn't acquiring something new, it's recalling something the soul already knew before it was born. He called this anamnesis, and he used the word in a dialogue where a slave with no education at all recalls a geometry theorem on his own just by answering questions. He never separated those two ideas. The lost continent and the soul that remembers come from the same philosopher in the same decade of his work. 2,300 years later, without citing Plato directly, two people describe something similar without knowing each other. Maurice Doreal, the leader of an esoteric order in Colorado in the 1930s, translating what he called the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. And Edgar Cayce, a psychic who never left the United States, also in the 1930s, in trance, describing Atlantean refugees arriving in Egypt with crystal technology and predicting a hidden hall of records near the Sphinx that no one has ever found. I need to be honest here. Neither source has archaeological backing. They're 20th century tradition, not historical discovery. I'll keep treating both that way, the whole way through. That's not a footnote. It's part of the argument, but the pattern still matters. Two narrators, no contact with each other, the same decade, describing the same migration. That doesn't prove Atlantis, it proves the image repeats itself, and recurrence is data, even when the source is questionable. Before I go on, I need to show you something. Stay with me here just for a second. Have you ever walked into a place you'd never been and felt certain you already knew what was around the corner, or felt inside your own house, for one strange instant, a kind of longing for it, as if it wasn't fully yours yet? The scribes of ancient Egypt had a word for what your body just did. Plato called it anamnesis, recollection, not imagination. It's not a metaphor, it's a retrieval. Modern psychology calls it déjà vu and moves on. The ancient traditions never moved on. They built entire practices around noticing those fragments, recording them, and trusting them. No proof required, only attention. Most people carry pieces of this their whole life and never write down a single one. By the end of this video, I'll show you exactly where to find the method the scribes actually used. Stay with me and check the pinned comment. What I'm about to show you is already waiting there. Back to what the papyri and the two visionaries have in common. What we've covered so far about Doreal and Cayce got framed as a coincidence of dates. Two people, same decade, same image. But when I look at it through the lens of recurrence, not proof, what shows up is different. The question isn't whether Atlantis physically existed. It's that the pattern of recognition showed up twice with no contact between the sources, decades before any YouTube channel existed. This reframe is small. It doesn't cancel what you just heard. It shows that it was evidence of something else, not a continent, a feeling that repeats in people who never met. Stop. Before we go on, the weight of what's been said needs to settle. This isn't archaeology of a lost continent. This is a pattern of recognition running through a Greek philosopher in the 4th century before Christ, 2 American visionaries in the same decade of the 20th century, and maybe you, right now, listening to this. That's not a figure of speech. It's a documented pattern across 3 distinct moments in recorded history, with no contact between them, separated by centuries and by continents. Carry that weight forward. The second half of this video is going to use exactly that recurrence as its foundation. What usually shows up as "you're making this up" isn't a failure on your part. It's the expected output of a structural mechanism. First, modern psychology has a ready-made name for the sensation, déjà vu, and the name functions as a full stop. Once it's named, the phenomenon gets filed away as a neurological curiosity, not as data worth investigating. Second, science, by design, prioritizes what can be replicated in a lab. A personal, non-repeatable sensation has nowhere to land inside that method, not because it's false, but because the instrument was never built to measure it. Third, without an alternative vocabulary, whoever feels the recurrence learns to stay quiet. No one coordinated a decision to silence that sensation. The system simply has nowhere to keep it. Fourth, anyone who studies this kind of sensation professionally risks their own academic credibility. A researcher who took unprovable memory seriously in public would be risking funding, publication, and reputation. That's not individual cowardice. It's the expected outcome of how the entire field is built. Here's what no one is connecting. Plato, the most rigorous philosopher of antiquity, is the same person who wrote down Atlantis and the doctrine that the soul recalls knowledge from before birth. If he never separated those 2 ideas, the question isn't whether Atlantis actually existed. It's what it means that the mind who founded Western logic also taught that you already knew things before you were born. That changes what you can ask about your own sense of familiarity. It's no longer, why am I making this up? It's, what instrument am I using to judge something that might need a different one? What I've described so far is verifiable, a structural mechanism with nowhere to keep this kind of sensation. But what that mechanism produces in practice is this. Someone feels a strong familiarity in front of a symbol, a place, an object, and the first reaction isn't curiosity, it's shame. Shame at saying it out loud. Fear that the explanation is too simple, that maybe you just want to feel special, that maybe it's only coincidence. Picture someone saying this at a dinner table. I walked into a city I'd never visited, and I knew what was around the next corner. The silence that follows that sentence, in a room full of reasonable people, is a specific kind of silence. It isn't hostility, it's discomfort, and the person who spoke is already backing away, already saying, never mind, it was probably nothing. That fear has a name. It's the fear of reaching the end without ever being sure you lived something real and finding out it was only something you invented. It isn't an abstract fear. It's the reason most people carry these sensations their whole lives and never write down a single one. Never tell anyone past that one time at the dinner table where they backed off mid-sentence. They hold it like shame when it could be data. This argument isn't about some abstract injustice. It's about what one specific act of naming, it's just déjà vu, does to the lives of specific people, including maybe yours. Notice that no one asks for proof of shame. No one asks for proof of fear. They only ask for proof of feeling. And it's exactly that uneven demand that teaches people to keep what they feel in silence. There's a reading of this subject that the field of cognitive psychology systematically doesn't make. It's worth naming why before making it. Research on perception is funded, published, and evaluated inside a paradigm that demands objective, replicable measurement. A reading that treats non-replicable subjective memory as valid data threatens the very criterion the whole field's funding depends on. It isn't conspiracy. It's incentive structure, the same kind that makes a healthcare system measure only what it can measure, even when what matters is something else. That's why the same sensation gets such different treatment outside tradition and inside it. A neurologist calls it a temporal lobe anomaly and moves on to the next case. An Egyptian scribe 4,000 years ago would have called it a signal to be recorded. The difference isn't about who's right, it's about which one of them has an instrument built to name what happened. Most channels that talk about Atlantis treat it as a mystery outside of you, a lost continent, waiting to be excavated and proven. My reading is different. If the Emerald Tablets and Cayce's readings are right about anything, it isn't about where Atlantis stood. It's about what it left behind in whoever carries the memory, not a geographic location, but a texture of recognition that some people feel and don't know how to name. The reading the field avoids isn't Atlantis existed. It's simpler and more uncomfortable. The sensation of recognition you've already felt with no proof at all might itself be data, not because science will eventually prove it, but because the instrument of proof it demands was never designed for this kind of phenomenon. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed, it's whether that sensation, yours, is data worth taking seriously. Notice I never asked you to believe Doreal or Cayce or me. I only asked you to notice that the instrument rejecting your sensation was never built to judge it. If the scientific field has nowhere to keep this sensation, is there any vocabulary, even a fringe one, that treats it as data? There is, and it comes from inside science itself, even if from its margins. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake, trained at Cambridge, proposed morphic fields, non-local memory patterns that repeat and reinforce themselves across time and space, with no need for a direct physical medium of transmission. It's a controversial hypothesis, rejected by mainstream biology, and I need to say that plainly. Sheldrake never managed to publish this hypothesis in the field's most prestigious journals, but it offers a language for what Doreal and Cayce described without knowing each other, a pattern repeating across different sources with no contact between them, as if the pattern itself carried enough weight to manifest more than once. Decades later, the physicist Ervin Laszlo proposed something structurally similar, an Akashic field, a universal field of information that would preserve records of everything that ever happened. The name comes from the Sanskrit word akasha, ether, the same word Western esoteric traditions have used for more than 100 years to describe the halls of Amenti, the hermetic halls of record attributed to Thoth. I'm not saying this proves Atlantis. I'm saying the idea of a memory that crosses ages shows up both in Sheldrake and Laszlo's controversial hypothesis and in the older Hermetic tradition. Two different languages, separated by 4,000 years, trying to name the same difficulty, how something can be remembered without ever being directly lived. What that still doesn't answer is the more practical question. If this sensation is data, what do I actually do with it day to day without turning it into blind belief? The answer isn't found in any single esoteric tradition on its own. It's in a practice of attention described by the researcher Jeremy Nadler in Temple of the Cosmos, studying how the Egyptians read sacred signs in everyday life. It isn't proof, it's a discipline of observation. The practice is easy to describe and hard to sustain. When an object, a symbol, or a place triggers a physical reaction with no logical explanation, your body freezing, your breathing changing, the urge not to move, you don't rationalize it in the moment. You write it down, date, place, what you saw, what you felt in your body, nothing more than that. No interpretation right away. The interpretation comes later, if it comes at all, sometimes weeks later, the way it happened for me with Doreal. The work, in the moment the sensation happens, is only to record it without editing. This isn't to prove anything to anyone. It's so you stop discarding your own data before you've even examined it. Most people do the opposite. They judge first and only record whatever's left over after the judgment, which is almost always nothing. A small notebook is enough. No app required, no ritual required. Just consistency, the same kind of consistency that had an Egyptian scribe training his whole life before being considered worthy of the craft. And this is exactly what changes everything that came before this point. I had one of those records, and I didn't know until I read Doreal what it meant. It was a Saturday afternoon inside a museum of Egyptian archaeology, an unremarkable case, a fragment of a seated scribe, papyrus across his knees, his face nearly worn away by time. At the start of this video, you probably had a ready answer for what happened there. Cultural conditioning, suggestion, coincidence. Now you're holding the whole argument in your memory. And none of those answers survive on their own against what's been built here, not because they're wrong, but because they answer a smaller version of the question, the size of a museum room, not the size of the whole pattern. The full version isn't about some statuette in some museum. It's about a pattern of recognition that ran through Plato, ran through Doreal and Cayce with no contact between them, ran through Sheldrake's hypothesis, and that afternoon ran through a person standing in front of a case, unable to name what he felt. That guard who looked at me twice didn't see anything special. He saw someone standing too long in front of a small object. He had no way of knowing that, for me, that moment would become the starting point of everything you just heard. That's the question still left to answer. What happened in front of that museum case wasn't an isolated incident. I'm asking that the next time your body stops in front of something with no logical explanation, you don't decide on the spot that it's foolishness. And if you can, write it down before you judge it. There's one thing this argument opened up that I'm specifically interested in hearing from you. If you've ever felt in front of a symbol, a place, or an object, that unexplained physical reaction, what this story about Thoth and Atlantis did to the way you hold on to that sensation. I'm not asking you to rate the video. I'm interested in what this pattern found in people who already lived this before they had a name for it, in contexts that probably have nothing to do with Egypt or Atlantis. The comments are right there. And before I close this video, I need to tell you something I started building out of all of this. So here's what we've been circling. Anamnesis isn't something you develop, it's something you recover. The scribes of ancient Egypt didn't invent this practice for Atlantis. According to later esoteric tradition, they inherited it from Thoth himself, guide of both verified history and the legend that grew around it. I spent months turning what they actually did into something you can practice today, the inner scribe protocol, a 4-step method for noticing, recording, and holding memories that don't feel like yours without needing anyone's belief, including your own certainty. It comes as one complete narrated experience. Listen to it, follow along in writing, move between both, however you take it in, with 7 interactive modules, a guided memory ledger, and a 21-day daily practice built in. Everything is in the pinned comment at the top of this page. If what we covered today felt familiar, that's not coincidence. That's an anamnesis doing exactly what it does. This argument deliberately never settled one question: what exactly each person is recalling when they feel this recognition. It isn't the same for everyone, and I can't claim precision here. That would take an entire video on its own, just on the practices of recollection, of anamnesis that the Hermetic tradition kept alive for centuries. I also deliberately didn't resolve whether Atlantis physically existed. That was never the right question from the start. and it may never have a definitive answer, no matter which channel you watch on the subject. What stays open on purpose is bigger than a sunken continent. It's what to do day after day, week after week, with a sensation that doesn't ask permission before it shows up. That's where the investigation goes next.